So it's 7 o'clock, so I think it's time to get started. So first of all, I'd like to thank everybody coming. This has been 6 months and actually a year and a half in the making, but really 6 months, the last 6 months of my life has been focused on the Northwest Indian Wars, and particularly the British and Native American Alliance. And it's been a pleasure to actually spend as much time as I have researching this. It's kind of like a dream when it comes to it. It has been a dream come true for me to actually do all this. One of the coolest things was I got to go up to the archives up at the University of Michigan and got to look at all documents from the 1790s. I was going through them just recently, realizing I have direct instructions from General Knox, the Secretary of War, to Anthony Wayne on how he's supposed to negotiate the Treaty of Greenville, like his specific instructions. So that was really cool. Started reading through it, and of course it's in cursive, so I'm like slowly reading it through. As I've been lucky to find out with a lot of the primary sources on that, I actually got to go through and look at, they were actually transcribed and put into a book form, so I didn't actually have to read the cursive. Although Anthony Wayne's handwriting was phenomenal. It was very easy to read for script and everything like that. So, but the wording is a little different, so some of the words are spelled slightly different on that. So, so I'd like to thank you on that, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me make sure. Okay. First of all, I would like to do some acknowledgement. I'd like to thank my wife, Karen, my kids. They have been very understanding and supportive of me during this whole project. They knew not to go in the office when I was working, and so there's been I'm working. So I do want to thank that. Dr. Korselman, I'd like to thank her as well. She unfortunately cannot be watching at this time, but she's been a great help, especially on my most frustrations. She's been my advisor. I've had her for this is the fourth course I've had with her, and it's been extremely helpful. And I'd also like to dedicate this to my sister Meredith, who had passed away back in January. So how did I get here? So how did I get to pick the topic of the British Native American Alliance of the Northwest Indian Wars? Well, what I ended up doing was we were told to we have a capstone project, so it's like a thesis. We had to pick something, and she wants us to pick a local. And so I was like, well, let's do the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Well, as I started doing research, there's not much new stuff out there, and it's more of a skirmish, not really a battle. So there wasn't a whole lot to really research. But what I noticed there was a lack of information, was a cohesive understanding of the British and the Native Americans in this time period and how they did ally together. So I kind of went through that, but like I said, there were some issues, questions that did arise. I researched ending the battle, like why did the British not help the Native Americans when they finished the battle, when they were retreating? And basically they were told not to, and so that kind of ended that idea. So I ended up going, okay, well, if they told them not to at the end of the battle, why were they allied in the first place? So what was their alliance really like? What was the situation? And I was recently watching a podcast with Ken Burns, the great documentarian, and as he always says, history, it's complicated. And you can't get much more complicated than this with that. So let's begin with the end, is the best way I want to do that. So the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which is literally, we're in that area right now, officially ended the official kind of like major engagements. There were still some small skirmishes afterwards, but it was basically kind of pretty much the end of this. Then the Treaty of Greenville, which ended the conflict and created peace, although I will say temporary peace, between the Native Americans and the United States. So the one thing I've noticed about is that a lot of people don't know about this conflict. They don't realize that this was an extremely important conflict in the development of the Army of the United States at this time. So up until this point, we were dealing with militias. So the militias that's how they wanted to fight, was with the militias. So who were the belligerents? Well, that's who we need to take a look at. So the Northwest Indian Wars. Let's go back. So the belligerents, there was 3 of them. There was the Native Americans, which consisted of roughly 8 to 10 Great Lakes tribes. The main ones were the Shawnee and the Miami. This would be Chief Little Turtle and Chief Blue Jacket. Little Turtle was kind of more of the low, how do I want to say this? He wasn't as aggressive, he was more strategic on what he did. He was in charge of what's called the Battle of Wabash or St. Clair's Defeat. And then you got Blue Jacket, which is what would be more considered a war chief, very aggressive. And he actually had the opposite effect when they did the Battle of Fort Recovery, which we'll get into. And then, of course, the United States. Well, my focus is really not on the United States part. There's plenty out there. But the one book that got me really interested in this was Autumn of the Black Snake, which is George Washington, Anthony Wayne, and the Invasion That Opened the West by William Hoagland. Very recommend it very highly if you're interested in the topic. It's really, really interesting. It tells how the Army was created and how they went from a militia-style defense into an actual standing army for the first time because, as I was telling my 8th graders, people saw the Army as a tool of the government against the people, against the citizens. So the United States saw the British soldiers more as their enemy than somebody to protect them. They were there to protect the king. So there was this idea. Okay, the Northwest Indian Wars, we need to talk about this. Where was the Northwest? The one thing that was interesting when I told people I was doing my research on the Northwest Indian Wars, they're like, great, I have tons of stuff about Washington and Oregon. It's like, okay, let's go back and do some history here. The Northwest Territory is actually Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. So this is the Northwest Territory. And it actually, there's some really cool things about the Northwest Territory. It was the first area that outlawed slavery. Slavery was not allowed in this due to the Northwest Ordinance. So, and it did two things. One is it set up the kind of the county system on how the counties were set up, like certain plots of land had to be for school, for business, and how they were sold. And then also it established how a state was to become a state at a certain point and level. So there's a lot, again, this time period was really interesting in how it developed United States identity going forward. Okay, so who was involved? As I said, the United States, Native Americans were the Miami, Shawnee, and several other. What's interesting is that one of the Iroquois Confederacy was a part of it, but they were kind of this two-sided. Chief Brant was very close to the United States, and he actually negotiated a treaty to kind of stop things after the Treaty of Paris of 1783 and gave up Kentucky even though they weren't in control of Kentucky. They actually gave up Kentucky to the United States for the expansion. So how it all started? Well, first of all, if you ever have a question of what treaty was this, if you say Treaty of Paris, you're most likely going to be right. Because the issues were raised after the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Now, this is where the British and the United States came together and said, okay, we're going to end hostility. We're going to recognize the United States as a country, as an independent country at this point in time. So the Native Americans were concerned because they weren't a part of this, even though they had fought with the British and they had plenty of land. So if we go back to the Treaty of Paris of 1763, this was after the French and Indian War. All the area of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, all this, the Northwest Territory was actually ceded to the Native Americans because of Pontiac's Rebellion, they wanted to keep that area. The British didn't want to spend more money protecting it. So the Native Americans were concerned that would they still have this area out with that. So, in particular, we're talking about the Ohio Territory. Settlers from the United States started moving into the territory right after actually before, but really after the treaty was signed. That was part of the reason why we fought the war, was to be able to expand, because they were promised, a lot of the soldiers that fought for the British actually were supposed to get territory in Ohio. Well, when the Proclamation Line of 1763 came up, they couldn't move into it because they weren't allowed to, or else the British weren't going to protect them. So it kind of had started because of that. Settlers in the United States started moving into which actually started shrinking the Native American territory. And of course, as usual, a clash between the settlers and the Native Americans had occurred. So there were three major engagements. There were a lot of minor ones, and we'll kind of talk about some of them ahead of time. But the three major were the Battle of Wabash, which is St. Clair's defeat, the Battle of Fort Recovery, which interestingly enough was the same as the Battle of Wabash, but they had the opposite happened. And I'll get to that in a minute. And then, of course, the end of the Battle of the Fallen Timbers. So the Battle of Wabash, which is known as St. Clair's defeat, was the worst defeat by the United States, by a United States force from a Native American against the Native Americans. So everybody thinks about the Battle of Custer's Last Stand, where they lost about 250 soldiers. With the Battle of Wabash, they lost over 1,000 soldiers, officers, and men. So this was actually extremely devastating to this. And as Washington found out about this, he is generally known as a very stoic president, doesn't show emotions, a very stoic person, can keep cool. And matter of fact, he was known for that during the Revolutionary War. He actually lost his cool for the first time in front of somebody for about a half an hour. He was yelling. I told St. Clair that they fought this way because it was an ambush. And Washington had seen this in the French and Indian War and several other places. And he said, I warned St. Clair about this. I warned him about this. As a matter of fact, St. Clair was brought up on charges and basically kind of found guilty, but kind of like just pushed to the side and out of the way because he was an embarrassment. But Washington, this was one of the times that he actually showed emotions about something. And William Hoagland in his book talks about how it wasn't the fact that he's lost his emotion. It was that he found out in the middle of dinner, finished dinner, kept calm, went into his office with his aide and the other guy, lost it for half an hour, and then he was calm back again. So the fact that he could control his emotion, that was what was more significant about it, was how quickly, like he found out in the middle of dinner and he was able to do that. The Battle of Fort Recovery was after Anthony Wayne had taken over and had actually trained troops. And this is where Blue Jacket got involved and went a little, got too aggressive because they had rebuilt the fort that was there. It was very fortified and they were trying to do frontal assaults on it with piecemeal between like 3 or 4 Indians at a time, Native Americans at the time, the warriors at the time, and you just can't do that. They were very solid. And Little Turtle was there and said, no, we need to retreat, but everybody was just so into it that they thought they could do the same thing they did again. But in this case, Wayne had actually trained his army, had about 2 or 3 years, because the Battle of Wabash was in 1791, 92, and then the Battle of Fort Recovery was about 3 years later. So he actually was able to get a somewhat trained army at this time. He had learned a lot from von Steuben during the Revolutionary War of how to actually train the soldiers. And then we have the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The one thing that I found interesting is that there were actually Canadians fighting with the Native Americans at the time, although they had to disguise themselves as Native Americans as not to be openly supporting the Native Americans as British subjects. So a war does not start. The interesting thing is both sides thought war was imminent, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But they both saw it. But there was about 70 Canadians that were actually fighting in the battle. The interesting thing is there were no cannons, there were no heavy artillery, and it's actually one of the reasons why Wayne didn't go any farther with the attack after Battle of Fallen Timbers, because there was Fort Miami, and he realized he couldn't attack it without getting into it. Okay, so we have the Treaty of Greenville. We have 2 pictures right here. So this one is the one I always knew about. I saw it came out in 1945, probably part of the work in progress, patriotism. But what's interesting is this one was actually painted at the treaty signing. They don't know who did it, but it was probably by one of General Wayne's assistants. And so a couple things you noticed in here is there's 2 sets here. So we have the Native Americans and several different of the chiefs. Little Turtle was definitely one of them that was there. But the one thing you do not notice here is that the one belligerent is the British were not represented at all, even though they were a major part, and we'll see this here, that they were actually more of a major part than everybody wants to talk about. And that was one of the things that I found interesting, is that after digging through the material, was that the British were highly involved in this conflict. Maybe not as openly, but they were highly involved. Okay, so my overall thesis. So now we're going to get into the good stuff. So I kind of have to back it up before I can start. So the British allied with the Native Americans during the Northwest Indian Wars for political revenge. We'll get into that, which is interesting. Key figures, so British Indian agents and Canadian colonial government officials. So these guys were actually key to this. And economic, access to the fur trade, lumber, and the Great Lakes trade routes for reasons. Due to the lack of direct commitment by the British, both the British and Native Americans suffered, with, of course, the Native Americans taking the worst of the suffering. And actually, unfortunately, it gave the United States a blueprint on how to move forward with any conflicts against Native Americans. They learned to use other tribes against. They would use one tribe to go fight another tribe and use the information from them as scouts and everything like that. So one of the things that make Native Americans one of the most interesting groups as a whole, although as I found, I really don't like to qualify them as all Native Americans because they're all different tribes, they all have different beliefs and different cultures, was that they were so separated and they had enemies amongst each others. So it's one of the most interesting part about them, but it's also one of the weaknesses that they had when it came to it. Because there are several examples of where, and this was one of them at the beginning of the war, where they bounded together. They came together, they allied together, and actually caused a lot of issues. Pontiac's rebellion before this was the same one. Pontiac got a bunch of Native American tribes to fight together to rebel against the British rule, and they were successful. But unfortunately, eventually they break apart. They have different ideas, or they will start pulling the tribes and make peace individually. And honestly, the United States did, before the Treaty of Greenville, they had done that with several of the other Great Lakes tribes before that, kind of weakening them. So unfortunately. So economics. So this was a rabbit hole. Dr. Korselman set me down because I was talking about the political and the social. And she's like, I know there's an economic reason. I'm like, you're right. And then I know more about the fur trade during colonial America than I ever thought or ever wanted to know about. But it's extremely interesting at the same time when you're looking at the numbers. So how the economics, so we'll take a look at each one and then we'll put them together to figure out how they fit together. So the British, they wanted access to the resources of the Northwest Territory, so furs and timbers particularly. The British would ship raw materials back to Britain, and then they would finish them, send them back, and sell them back to the colonists. So if they were taking the raw materials from the United States, shipping them back to England, making stuff out of them. So if the timber, they would make wood, furs, they would make beaver. Particularly, they were looking for the beaver because they made really good pelts. And then they would send them back to sell them in colonial America. So they were making money both ways, one in collecting the materials and one in selling the finished goods. Because then they would take the furs back, they would make money off of that. And then once they made the hats, they'd make it back. There was a lot of regulations, and I didn't even know about this. They limited the number of hat makers in the United States. Well, it was British colonial America at that time, but they limited the number so that way they couldn't supplement the people that were making them back in England. So they really limited what happened. So economics is very key for this. Within the United States, controlling these resources, we're free to trade. Oh yeah, with the United States, now that Treaty of Paris is signed, we could freely trade with anybody. Spain was still had the Northwest Territory, Louisiana Territory, so we could trade with Spain. We were really good with the French at that point. Well, for a little bit until the French Revolution, where, everything went downhill for that. And then Britain was concerned that they would lose access to both the raw materials and the trade routes, particularly through the Great Lakes. They were also worried that the Americans were going to expand into Upper Canada. Now, when I say Upper Canada, that's Ontario, so that's right across. So upper is different than what most people think. It's upriver, so it's usually inland more, and then lower is towards the ocean. So Upper Canada would be Ontario. Lower Canada is actually towards the coast, like the Hudson Bay and along the Atlantic Ocean. So that's actually Lower Canada. So that makes a difference. So they were concerned they would lose access to this. So let's take a look at the Native Americans, because this was something that I had to put together when I started to think of this. So when you say, oh yeah, the Native Americans lost, trade areas to fur trade. Well, yeah, that's important. Everybody just kind of glosses over why that's important. What I found out is that their culture had changed. So the Native Americans were subsistence farm. Many believe that they were just subsistence farmers. They just made enough. They stayed in their little area, except for the nomadic ones in the Great Plains, which always moved around. But what we have found out in archaeological evidence has found out that trading was extremely important. But what they wouldn't trade, so they would trade with other tribes, and then those tribes would trade with other tribes farther inland. They have found shells, the wampum that was used for the New England tribes, all the way in the Great Plains and even on the West Coast tribes. So this trade had moved through. They were actually looking for the nicest stuff. They wanted to trade for the nice, good-looking stuff. That's the whole, this whole idea that all they did was farm and just kind of live peacefully. No, they were active traders, extremely strong active traders with other tribes, and with that. So they were adept at getting the trade and everything like that with the tribes. And then, so what ends up happening is after the contact with the Europeans, so we're talking in the 1600s, their culture started to change because they realized they could make money on the trade. So instead of farming, what they would do is they ended up focusing on trading. So what ended up at the beginning, what they would do, they would still farm, but then they would hunt and trap in their off times, because farming, you kind of plant and then you just wait for it to grow and then harvest it. And in the wintertime, which in trapping was really good, because the furs were thicker at that time, they could trap because they couldn't farm. So they just choose often. But what ends up happening is they realize they can farm or they can trap even more. So their whole culture had changed from this trapping on the off times to just completely always trapping. And they've got to the point where they actually have found where Native Americans actually would strip the furs and just leave the bodies out into the wild. They wouldn't use everything. Compared to if you go to the Great Plains where they would hunt the buffalo, they used everything on the buffalo. They didn't leave anything. And so this was an interesting idea that I found through a dissertation of a gentleman at Slippery Rock University who teaches at Slippery. I actually reached out to him and he gave me some good information on that. He said a lot of the fur trade was illicit. So there's actually no real numbers at the forts, or you'd have to go to each fort to figure it out. So there's a lot of, underhanded deal. Hey, we'll give this and that. But what he found out was there was a lot of trading going on for metals and things like that because they didn't have the technology for the metals, and then eventually went into firearms and things like that. But they actually preferred a lot of the European clothing after a while because of the quality of it. So the United States, so we're going to talk about the United States. So the United States, they wanted the territory for a totally different reason. They wanted to farm. They wanted to strip it, farm it, because that was what they did. And particularly what it was you had planters from the plantations in Virginia, particularly George Washington was one of these, would come up to the Ohio Territory and saw how fertile the land was. And so they knew it was good for farming. What they didn't know is that it wasn't good for farming tobacco, which is what they were hoping to, but it was good for farming other things like corn and things like that. So, because Washington was a tobacco farmer, and he actually lost a lot of his tobacco, his farm plantations, because of that, because he had used up the soil. So he was looking for more farming with that. And actually, at this point now, he was looking to just sell the stuff. He wanted to get the land and then just sell the land. So he was more of a land speculator at this point. But originally, he looked to expand for farming. So the Native Americans wanted the same land to hunt for furs. The United States wanted to do this. And so if the settlers took too much of the land, which they were, the Native Americans would lose their way of life. Because remember, the culture had changed from the subsistence farming into the hunting and trading ideas. And so all of a sudden, you're taking some of these livelihood away. So yeah, no wonder why they fought for it. I have, with that. It totally makes sense. So the economic benefits of alliance. So how did it work out? So what the British, by allying with the Native Americans, what the British were able to do, they would keep access to the raw materials, the trade routes, and already trading partners. They had already agreements with a lot of these the Native American traders, the fur trappers. So these were already done. So I wanted to find some numbers. And this is where I got into that rabbit hole of the fur trade, is The fur trade alone brought in 200,000 pounds. I was like, well, in 1790, that sound, I don't know, 200,000 pounds, what is that? So that is the equivalent to 35 million pounds, or the equivalent of $48 million today. That is a major industry. And by losing the territory that they lost in the Treaty of 1783, they would lose access to a good portion of that. Not all of it, because some of it they still had Upper Canada, but there was a good portion of it that they would have lost. The duties alone brought in around 5 million pounds in today's money. So that's huge. It was like, it said like 90 or 30,000 pounds. I was like, okay, again, what is that in today's? 5 million pounds, which equates to about $7 to $8 million. That's huge for a government, especially during this time. I mean, our government would love to have an extra 8 million bucks, you know, and back then that was even more vital with that. What the Native Americans were able to do, why they allied, is they were able to continue to hunt the land that they had for generations now, because we're talking several hundred years now into this. They had trade partners that had already traded for years, they trusted, and we'll get into that, particularly one of them, and they were able to keep their way of life. So the alliance made sense here. It wasn't just, hey, let's get together. So the alliance made sense on this. Now, the second part of it is political or revenge. So what was interesting, I did not know, they did not give up all their forts after the Treaty of Paris of 1783. They actually kept 6 of them. 2 of them particularly were Fort Michilimackinac, and I'm proud that I can say that because it does not look like that word, as well as Fort Detroit. And throughout all my readings, the United States knew that they were supplying the Native Americans with ammo, supplies, and everything like that through Fort Detroit. It was well known. It wasn't really a secret. But they didn't know that. So at the end of the Revolution, many of the soldiers felt betrayed by Britain because they basically gave up, especially the Loyalists. So the ones that were born in what is now the United States, at that point the United States, but they were very loyal to Britain. But what ended up happening by not including Canada as a 4th colony, which was possibly, but I always blame John Adams for that one, because they didn't send up the right people to make it. But that's a tangent I could go on a different way. But because Canada was still not a colony, they actually had to, that's where a lot of the Loyalists ended up moving to, was that area. So they were worried they were going to lose that because they saw the United States was expanding. So, but they had moved there, and some left the United States for fear of retribution. They were scared. A lot of them were very scared of that. They moved to Upper Canada, as we talked about where that was. They feared the United States stand, and they wanted the Ohio Territory as a buffer. So they didn't want the United States to get into the Ohio Territory because it was a good buffer from them invading into Upper Canada. So they're like, Michigan and Ohio was a nice buffer. So with that, the leadership of Upper Canada saw a conflict between the U.S. and Britain happening soon. By the way, General Wayne was authorized to start a war with Britain if need be. Came from Washington and came from General Knox. They said, you can start a war if you want to. I have no problem with that. We need to take control of this. So we'll get into particularly who the gentleman was in Upper Canada that made this big deal. But there was an idea. The Native Americans were already fighting the American settlers, and they had already seen St. Clair's defeat, so they knew the Native Americans could do this. What they didn't realize was that that actually pushed the United States into having a standing army at the time. The Native Americans felt betrayed by the Treaty of Paris because the land that they were told that they was theirs was no longer theirs. They had to deal with the United States. There was a Treaty of Fort Halifax, which most of them didn't recognize because, again, it was negotiated by Chief Brant of the Iroquois Confederacy. He played both sides really well. He knew how to play the British and the Americans, and he was one of those really well politicians. He knew where to put his eggs as he saw the war starting to change. He knew where he needed to be close to, which was very good for the Iroquois Confederacy. They made out pretty well with this. Unfortunately, it was at the cost of several other Native American tribes. And actually, as time went on, a lot of the Native American tribes did not trust Joseph Brant because of that. Had strong connections between the British agents that had influence in both worlds, And we'll talk about one particular one that I've really enjoyed reading about and understood. And they already knew that they were being supplied by the British from Fort Detroit. So easily the political benefits, the Native Americans fight for the British and the British don't have to get involved, like not too much, they can supply. It creates a British buffer for Upper Canada and looked positive for the Native Americans with the defeat of St. Clair's. I forgot to finish that part. Native Americans, they received supplies from the British, they got to control their land back, and they already had agreements with the British and strong connections. So that's how it works. Now, key figures, there's two of them, Alexander McKee and John Graves Simcoe. Both of them were loyalists. Well, actually, John Graves Simcoe was actually born in Britain, so he would be considered pure British or however they want to do it because they always looked down upon the colonists. They did. The ones that lived in England looked down upon the colonists that were born in the colony, unless they had a strong family lineage. Now, Alexander McKee was born from Thomas McKee, who was Scottish, came over, very loyal to the British. So we're going to get into him because he is probably the key to this whole situation. So he was born in Pennsylvania to Thomas McKee. His mother was Shawnee. We don't know much about her, actually. So he was actually raised in the Shawnee culture because Thomas McKee was a trader. So and a trader as in he traded, not a traitor. But he actually was raised, and this is, by the way, this is an image of Mr. McKee. Colonel McKee, actually, I'll give him the respect. He actually fought for the British against the Americans during the War of Independence. He was forced to relocate. He was originally from the Pittsburgh area, and he was forced to relocate into Upper Canada because of his loyalties to the British. He actually was forced and chose to because he wanted to do that. He was a trusted advisor throughout the conflict. Now, the book that I found first was by Larry Nelson, A Man of Distinction Among Them. So this is Alexander McKee and the Ohio Frontier, 1755 to 1799. He passed away in 1799. And as it goes into this, you can see why his loyalties lied with not only the Shawnee, but also the British. And a lot of people assumed he was very loyal to the Shawnee, but he was actually looking out for both sides. Kind of like 60-40 British type deal. He was really very loyal to the crown because they had treated him well. And then he also saw the advantages of actually partnering with it. So Alexander McKee, by all means, was the reason why he was so important to this conflict. He advised on all the battles. He was there at almost all the battles. He tried to keep them from going too far at Fort Recovery. He actually tried to keep them from going to Fort Recovery because he knew it was a failure waiting to happen. He actually watched the Battle of Fallen Timbers from his house. So basically, I can see Russia from my front yard. So, so he actually watched, and he was advised not to get involved because at this time, and McKee kind of understood what was going on, and he hated it because he had to keep it away from Little Turtle and all the other Native Americans, is that the Jay Treaty was going on at the time. And this was a treaty between John Jay, the United States, and the British to kind of fix the stuff that was left over that was kind of vague in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. So this would be like giving back those forts and things like that. So he knew that was going to happen, but he still advised him. I think he thought for sure that the Native Americans would have won. And actually, if not for a rain the day before, they probably would have because they had the numbers and they had some understanding of how to fight. But there was a severe rain. The battle stopped because they were waiting for the General Wayne's troops to come up. That was a very narrow path. You guys know this was a swamp at one point in time, so it wasn't very easy to get around. So there was a path, pretty narrow area that they could walk. They were waiting for them, but because of the rain, they waited. The warriors got hungry, so half of them went back to get supplies to come back, and that's when they attacked. Wayne did not know this at the time. It just was one of those, chaos of the battle. It just happened to be that way. Now, the reason why McKee thought for sure that he was going to get the support, through most of the conflict was because of John Gay Simcoe. He was the lieutenant governor of Upper Canada, so he was appointed. He actually fought at the Battle of Yorktown and was wounded. So he actually witnessed the surrender of the British at the Battle of Yorktown. He was very bitter about that, by the way. He was very, very bitter about losing to the United States, as most colonial generals and soldiers were for the British. They were very upset about it. He wanted to recover. His little goal was to get in Upper Canada and recover the territory that was lost. Now, the reason why Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana was kind of in that area is because it was very vague in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. People could kind of read it one way or another, that they weren't supposed to have the territory, or it wasn't very specific on exact definitions. It said territory south of the Great Lakes. Well, that's a lot. So there was a little bit of vagueness on exactly. So he's like, I want to recover this territory because we could still have this. It wasn't an official colony, unlike like New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina. They weren't official. They weren't colonies. So it was just territory. So he thought, hey, I can go back there. I can get this territory back. So he understood the potential of the Native Americans because he saw St. Clair's defeat. He saw what they could potentially do. Also, he would have witnessed Pontiac's Rebellion and what they were able to do with Pontiac's Rebellion. There was a lot of potential with this, and believed that war was inevitable. And that was because of Lord Dunmore, the governor of Canada. So he was a lieutenant governor of Upper Canada, and then there was Lower Canada. So Lord Dunmore also agreed with this. Like, this is going to happen. We're going to get in war. Where I think the interesting part is because the people on the ground, it took 6 months to get information back and forth between Whitehall and London and back. They weren't getting, it wasn't like they could call them and say, hey, yeah, this is going on. We can do this. We can get this done. No, by the time the situation had changed so much that it wasn't done. And also, those individuals back in Britain honestly really didn't care that much about what was going on in a territory that they no longer technically controlled. They were more worried about, at this point in the 1790s, France and Napoleon. So one of the reasons why they forced their hand to make to kind of do a treaty to get done was that Napoleon was doing his thing and they were fighting against France again. So that's another thing. If you ever have a question about England and who they were fighting, if you say France, you're probably right. Okay. It's just interesting. So a couple other important individuals. So we have Chief Little Turtle. I was going to pronounce his name, but I've forgotten how it's pronounced again. But I always like to include, as I tell my students, I like to understand where their names are, what their exact names are, because this is the Miami tribe, the Miami language. This would be Shawnee. And so the Miami chief understood to be one of the most influential members of the Confederacy, because this was a confederacy again. So like the Iroquois Confederacy had about 9 to 10 tribes. This was a Great Lakes Confederacy as well. So they would have upper Great Lakes tribes all the way through. It's really interesting to see how well they worked together for as long as they did, but unfortunately it still does this. Blue Jacket was very warrior aggressive, and he led the failed attack on Fort Recovery, unfortunately. We have General Anthony Wayne, which was the leader of the 1st Legion of the United States. This is what they called the Army. The U.S. Army at the time was the 1st Legion of the United States. He created disciplined military units, somewhat. I won't give him exact credit for a completely disciplined, but for the amount of time he had to create an army out of nothing, basically, or a bunch of ragtag militias, plus some Kentucky militia as well, horse militia as well. He did a pretty good job. He understood that he understood the role of the army at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. He understood not to wait for the artillery to come up, because then the Native Americans and the British could possibly get in there involved. Because at this point, Fort Miami, which is in Maumee right now, or what is now Maumee, was actually built and was pretty formidable at that point, because it has been built for about 2 or 3 years at this point. They had got it. And they had artillery, which General Wayne did not have. And so he literally would go up to he spent several days around the fort kind of just teasing them. Like, go ahead, start something. But he knew he couldn't take it because of his lack of artillery. He couldn't get into the fort, so he kind of understood that. And then we have Simon Girty. He was part of the Indian agents as well with Alexander McKee. So he actually, there was a couple of them that were very integrated into both. Not only did they know like the language, but they knew the customs. They knew how to interact. There was a lot. One of the comments that was made by Henry Knox uh, um, about negotiating with the Native Americans was they like to talk a lot. They're very long speeches. And actually, after reading Little Turtle's speech, I kind of understood what he meant by that. They really like to explain things and talk about things. It was really interesting with that. Okay, so results. Who got what? So spoiler alert, the first Legion of the United States won, which we know that because we live here. Okay, so the Native Americans and British were not treated the same. So the British had signed the Jay Treaty before the Treaty of Greenville. And what was interesting was Alexander Hamilton actually ruined this for John Jay because he told them that they wouldn't hold, it was something about they wouldn't do something no matter what. And he kind of told some British individuals about this to like uppers. And so when Jay was trying to negotiate, he really didn't have much to negotiate on. But what he was able to do was basically able to get all of the 6 forts back in the United States. That was in United States territory. So there's 3 along in New York, along the Ontario, along Lake Ontario there. There was 3 forts there. Niagara was one of them. And then the Native Americans signed the Treaty of Greenville. So the Jay Treaty was negotiated during the end of the conflict. So before the conflict ended, the Jay Treaty was pretty much so done. So almost to the point where they knew it was almost done that they had no open assistance during the Battle of Fallen Timbers. If you remember, I talked about the Canadians that had to dress up. This was the reason why, is because the British government didn't want them ruining anything that they had already set up. So the British actually made out pretty well on the Jay Treaty. And the U.S. had, like I said, the U.S. had no real leverage. The treaty ended the supplying of Native Americans against the United States. They abandoned the forts that were that their territory of the United States. So those were the 6 forts, and gave trade access, but they gave this, so they still had access to the trade. So they may not have had the forts. And some of the historians have said that the forts were pretty much so useless at this point anyways. They pretty much had already got all the furs they needed, but they could end up accessing them elsewhere and trade with them as well. So the Treaty of Greenville, so it ended official hostilities against United States settlers and troops. The Indian Territory was greatly reduced, greatly. So basically, just Northwest Ohio was pretty much, so they went from having all of Ohio to pretty much just Northwest Ohio and some Michigan area. And eventually that would be even removed. The Miami tribes nowadays are located in Oklahoma. So everybody knows the Trail of Tears from the South. Well, there was kind of a northern version of that as well. So where they moved all the Miamis and Shawnees and moved them out to Oklahoma as well. Somewhat less known, but it was just as horrible. It ended any resistance in the Northwest Territory, so pretty much so after this, everybody kind of was like, okay, we're here. And the Native tribes were given a one-time payment for the land that they had given up, but it was probably nothing that was actually worthwhile because most of it was in trade goods, not actually money. So the results, remember I said that the British actually, they did lose some. So they did lose reputation with the Native Americans and the Loyalists. Although what was interesting is that a lot of them kind of kept that information, kind of kept it going. And then during the War of 1812, they allied with the British again. So it was interesting. So it was like, okay, can't you see what's been happening? But yeah, they saw that as their best option. And sometimes that's not always a good option. The loss of forts that were established in U.S. territory, they were going to try to burn them down, by the way, try to raise them. But the United States said, no, you can't do that. But they stripped them bare. They left nothing other than like the walls, basically, in the building, which makes sense. And they were able to keep access through the Great Lakes, through the natural resource. Because you got to remember, Spain was still out of control of the Louisiana territory. So they were still able to access most of the West. Although, according to Thomas Jefferson, there were still woolly mammoths out west. He truly believed that until he sent Lewis and Clark out there. He believed that there were still woolly mammoths alive on the West. Well, if you count a buffalo, It's kind of a woolly mammoth. It's a fuzzy cow.
Yeah.
So don't pet the fuzzy cows. Okay, the Native Americans lost the land, they lost their way of life, and peace was only temporary. As I said, they were eventually removed off their land. Tribes were eventually forced to move to Oklahoma, and not only that, particularly the Miami tribes, there were 3 factions of those. So there was still a faction of the Miami tribes that did not want anything to do with the Europeans or anything like that. There was a faction that kind of did a little bit of both, and there's one that was like full, let's ally with it. So there's 3 different factions, so they actually split that up. And unfortunately, it set an example for future conquests of the Native American tribes moving forward. So it's one of those things that, as I tell my students, I'm going to tell you about everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, and this is one of the ugly parts of our history. So with that. In conclusion, although suffering some, the British were able to make the best of the situation, use the Native Americans to make sure they still had access to at least some of the resources in the West. The Native Americans' losses are still observable today. They don't live in the areas where they originally were found, so you can still see that. Although in rebound, the Native Americans did not just lose their land, they lost much of their culture and would be considered the tragic loser of this conflict. When you look at it, far back, now that we're 2020 on that. So I've actually gone through, that actually took longer than I thought it was. I was afraid that'd be a half an hour. So, but are there any questions? You guys have any questions coming through? There's a lot of information here. I know it's kind of like an information dump, but it is what it is. Do you have any questions at all for me? And let me check out here. I have quite a few people. We have a couple people watching. So if you have any questions in the chat, by the way, I'm actually can look at those and yes.
So we're talking sort of a what-if scenario here, but if the British had kind of gone whole in and really backed the Indians in this event, what would you consider to have been the outcome of that?
Probably, I believe that Ohio and Michigan would have been given up to the British because it depends on when they did that. If they went whole hog right after St. Clair's defeat, I don't think there was not much they could do because the British were not fighting anybody at that point in time. They could put their resources into it. There were enough Native Americans, there were enough loyalists still living in the colonies. I think that would come up to recruit. So I do think if the British would have actually went whole hog, focus, get this, back these guys up, we're going to add troops as well. I don't think the U.S. would have been able to recover from that. We're able to build up enough army. I think they could have taken basically Michigan and Ohio without too much of an issue on that. But so yes, I do think that. I was just seeing if there's any questions on that. Yes.
How long did the battle go on?
About 2 hours. It was actually not a very long battle. I actually, after doing the research, I consider it more of a skirmish than a battle. There was less than 100 casualties throughout both sides. So most of them were like more woundings than actually death. There were like less than 40 deaths, I think. So it was more of a skirmish, and a lot of it had to do with the territory. The Native Americans had learned how to retreat properly, and then they would fight a little bit and then retreat again. And to the point where finally, I think the U.S. troops just got tired because of the weather and things like that. So they kind of we've got to remember this was August, so it's not comfortable, very humid. This was a swamp still, so who knows what, like that, the diseases and things like that. So, but yeah, it was a short, like I said, I consider it more of a skirmish now than a battle. So, but it was effective, and basically it wasn't the death blow of eliminating, it was more of a morale killer for the Native Americans at that point, because they had already lost. So after losing Fort Recovery, the Northern Lake tribes had left the Confederacy and went back to their territory. So they actually had lost a few tribes because of that. And so they actually had the numbers. If you were able to include all of them, they actually had the numbers of warriors. Problem was half of them were trying to go get supplies to feed the other warriors at that point, while the U.S. troops were just moving up. So Like I said, General Wayne actually kind of understood this. General Wayne in himself is an interesting character in the fact that he actually is a better military person than a better individual. His personal life was horrible. He had estranged kids and lawsuits with their kids. Yeah, so but he was a great military general, which I come to find out that's generally the way it is. If they're great military, generally the personal life is a tragedy. I mean, if you look a lot of them. But what it showed me by doing the research, it showed me how close it was, that it wasn't like this runaway kind of battle or this runaway conflict. A lot of it was based on economics. So at the beginning, before the St. Clair's defeat, it was more of an economic warfare where they would attack like farms and things like that for both sides. So there was a huge city. So unfortunately one of the ideas or one of the problems with thinking about the Native Americans is there's this belief that they were small, but they had actually cities of tens of thousands. And there was one that had miles and miles of cultivated crops. And the U.S. troops just came. Kikiyanga is the name of the town. It was the name of the town. And actually, I think it's in Indiana. It would be in Indiana now. But they would destroy the crops. And then when they came back, the crops were regrown. Like they were able to rebuild and things like that. So it's the idea that these were not civilized or barbarians is far from the truth. But also the whole idea of the noble savage is not accurate either. So there was a lot of warfare between the tribes, but when they actually got together, it's very interesting how effective they were when they did get together and fighting against the Europeans. It's just unfortunately they couldn't hold that unity together, which is, you see that even today, even in most conflicts, when you get allies together, they all have their own ideas of what they need to do, and you can't actually, it's usually not all in one. So any other questions or anything like that? Yeah.
What happened with the fur trade? I think your year was 1790.
1790, yeah. Yep.
After the battle, did the U.S. pick up that trade?
Yeah, so the numbers that I saw were specifically from New York, and of course the way it worked out, New York kind of expanded all the way out. So yeah, they actually picked it up, but the issue was that beaver the furs had started to become out of style. So the amount of trade actually dropped dramatically. They were still very highly sought after, but it wasn't as much as it was originally. So they had actually lost some of the popularity with that. But the beavers here in the United States were massive compared to the ones they had in Europe, and they had pretty much so hunted the ones in Europe into extinction. I don't even know. I think they actually did, if there's any few left. But the beavers that were here were also like 4 or 5 times the size. So they were when they saw that, they couldn't believe that they were beavers in the first place. But yes, and they actually did hunt a lot of them. I think it really got bad for a while there. They had overhunted them as usual. During this time, it's kind of, they find a resource. They didn't understand, how to keep natural resources going. Although a lot of the Native Americans still do that. They were actually able to do a lot of that anyways. They naturally did that. So it's interesting. There's a lot of ideas that turning over some of the lands back over to Native Americans to actually conserve them, because they're good stewards of the lands. So, but again, it was the influence of the money of the trade that actually took them out of what they used to do. When it was just, oh, we're going to do this extra, well, then they started doing it as a job. So,
what was the sentiment between the British and the Americans at the time?
Oh, it was bad.
like, did the British, were they congregated in a certain area, or were they more spread out because they were just looking for more opportunity somewhere?
Basically, they were in Lower Canada or Upper Canada, right along Lake Erie. So like Toronto and that area. Not Toronto, Ontario. All that, basically, that's where they stayed. Like right at Detroit, which is now Windsor, by the way. They stayed in that area. So they were. The interesting thing is they didn't move far away. They just moved kind of across the lake. is basically.
So you go across the lake, stir shit up.
Yeah,
go back.
yeah, exactly. So, matter of fact, McKee's residence in Lower Canada is actually in outside of Niagara. So he'd actually then come across, stir up stuff, and then get the sediment, and then he could go back. But he was the Indian agent, so he had to report back to like Simcoe and everything like that, and tell them what was going on, and then he could relay that. So, the sentiment was extremely bad, which is one of the reasons why they left the colony. Well, now the United States, they left the States and moved to Canada, is because they were treated as traitors. And honestly, the fact that this book was written, let's see, when was this written? It was in the 90s. I actually reached out to Mr. Nelson. He's a really helpful guy, gave me a lot of sources. But there's another book out that talked about how these guys were so viewed as traitors, they weren't even talked about in historical circles for the longest time, at least on the American side. So the fact that and he's a professor of history at BG, or was, I think he's retired now. But the fact that he wrote this, in the 90s, basically 200 years later, 200 years plus later, and they're finally starting to understand. I actually think McKee's a very courageous man. I don't agree that he fought that he fought for the British, but he stuck to his beliefs. And so it's interesting to see a lot of these people that we consider enemies or were considered traitors are very interesting in that how they actually they just stuck with their beliefs. Now, I don't believe that with Benedict Arnold. He's a traitor. So he was a great general until he traded on us.
Well, if you were a traitor, you had to work both sides of the fence.
Yeah. So, but no, McKee was actually, I dug so deep in his rabbit hole between the fur trade and him. It was probably one of the most interesting rabbit holes that I had gone down, because I'm like, this guy is actually really awesome. He was a great person too, and then also really protected what he thought was important with the Shawnee. And he thought the Native Americans should deserve to keep their land and keep their things. So I was like, this guy's really good, but they wouldn't talk about him because of he was a loyalist. He fought against the United States. So, and actually with John Graves Simcoe, he actually outlawed slavery in Canada before the British actually outlawed slavery, the slave trade. He ended the slave trade in Canada before, in Upper Canada. And then so they actually have a John Graves Simcoe Day. So they actually celebrate him in Canada every year. So, which is interesting. I did not know that. So that was, yeah. So, and the funny thing is we're, basically 40, just right across the lake and all this stuff that we were a part of. So, yep. Any further questions? Let me see if I've got anything. Okay. I recognize these people. They're actually like, okay, that's pretty interesting. They're talking about the games, because a lot of them are my gaming buddies, and they're talking about the games that cover the stuff that I'm talking about. So, all right.
Was the battle at Wabash where Wabash University is?
I think so. Yeah, it's in Indiana. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, because it was in Wabash. So that's, yeah. So, yep. Yeah. So that, when I found out the number of people that died, the number of American soldiers that had died or the casualties, I was like, oh my God. I was like, what about, I said Wounded Knee. I'm like, no, it's not. It's Custer's last stand. So I looked at Custer. They only lost 250, and that was Custer's fault. So, because he decided to go into the middle of a village, not, the end. So, but losing, over 1,000 casualties on this battle was insane. I couldn't believe that. I'm like, no wonder why Washington was so pissed when so upset when that happened. So, yeah. And the fact that he lost is cool. Like, I've learned a lot about Washington. I'm still 50-50 on him. I like him, but then also I have some issues with him as well, which, again, it's complicated. Because he knew what he had to do was just keep an army, whether it was like 5 people or 50,000, he just had to keep an army in the field, and he knew how to retreat. As a military general, you don't want to be known as the master of the retreat, because it doesn't work. So, all right, any other further questions? Okay, I do have a quick feedback form if you could fill out. Basically, I pulled out my teacher, and basically what I like to do is like, what is one thing you learned about what was one thing you're interested in? Was there still a question that you would like to ask? And then if you have any other feedback for me, I'd appreciate it very much if you could do that. By the way, those watching, there's a link in my video for a Google form. So I can figure it out. So